The knife was already at Evander Lazarescu's throat when Lucia Vaughn decided she was not going to let a vampire prince die in the archive basement. She had not planned for this. She had planned for cataloguing 3 boxes of 16th century court manuscripts, a thermos of black coffee, and the particular silence that descended on the Meridian archive after 9 in the evening, when every other researcher had gone home, and the building became entirely hers. She had planned for ink-stained fingers and the low satisfaction of giving lost things their proper names. She had not planned for the side door to the lower stacks to blow open on a windless October night, or for the man who came through it to collapse against the oak shelving, with one hand pressed to his ribs and silver-white hair, falling across a face that was too beautiful and too pale and too ancient to belong to any living person she had ever encountered. She had not planned for the second man to follow him through the door 6 seconds later with a blade pressed to the first man's exposed throat and a smile that carried no warmth at all. "Evander Lazarescu," the second man said, and his voice was smooth in the way that expensive poison is smooth, designed to go down easily. "The Moldavian Blood Council sends its regards." Lucia stood very still beside her work table. She held a manuscript box in both hands. It was not a weapon. She was an archivist, not a fighter, and she understood her own capabilities with clear-eyed precision. But she also understood something the man with the knife did not seem to have accounted for. He was standing in her archive in her basement, under the fluorescent lights she had worked under for 4 years, and she knew every exit, every switch, every hidden corner of this space in the way that only a person who has spent thousands of solitary hours in a place can know it. The prince, if that was what he was, met her eyes across the distance of the room. His were dark crimson at the edges. The way she had read about in texts she had always assumed were metaphorical. They were not metaphorical. They were the most arresting eyes she had ever seen in her life, burning with some combination of sovereign fury and something rawer underneath it, something that looked almost like the specific shame of being witnessed in a moment of vulnerability. "Leave," he said to her. The word was low and commanding, and entirely unhesitating, even with a blade at his throat. "This is not your concern, human." She set the manuscript box down very carefully. "You're bleeding on my archive floor," she said. "Everything that happens in this room is my concern." His jaw tightened. The man with the knife laughed softly. "How charming," the knife holder said. "A little archivist. Stay out of this, girl, or I will add you to the evening's business." Lucia reached sideways without looking away from either of them, and found the master electrical panel she had reported to maintenance as faulty for 3 months running. The one that, when struck firmly on the upper left corner, would cut all power to the lower level for 45 seconds before the emergency override engaged. She had learned this by accident on a late Thursday evening in February, and had filed the maintenance request immediately as a responsible employee. She had also, in some small and private way, never entirely forgotten that she knew it. She struck the panel. The basement went black. She moved the story of how she had arrived in that basement on that particular night, and how Evander Lazarescu had arrived in that city at all, was longer than 45 seconds and considerably more complicated than a faulty electrical panel. But it had been building toward this moment for weeks in the way that catastrophes always build, quietly and then all at once. The way a river swells beneath its surface long before it breaks the bank. Evander was the second son of the Lazarescu bloodline, which meant he was a prince of the oldest vampire court on the continent, and the heir presumptive to the Moldavian throne following the assassination of his elder brother, Caius, 6 weeks prior. He had not wanted the throne. He had made peace with not wanting it over the course of 2 centuries, had built a life of deliberate distance from the court's endless cycles of ambition and betrayal, moving between the old capitals of Europe, with the quiet ease of someone who understood that belonging to a dynasty did not require inhabiting it. He spoke 7 languages. He kept apartments in Vienna and Bucharest that contained more books than furniture. He had opinions about Renaissance archival methods that he had never shared with anyone, because sharing them would have required trusting someone, and trust was a thing the vampire courts had straightened out of him before he was 50 years old. Then Caius died, and everything changed. The Blood Council of Moldavia. which governed the vampire nation with the particular cruelty of bodies that have had centuries to refine their methods of control, declared Evander the heir apparent and summoned him to court to undergo the claiming, a ritual binding that would tie his sovereignty to the council's authority in ways that were, diplomatically speaking, indistinguishable from a gilded cage. Evander had attended enough claimings to understand exactly what was being offered to him, and had made a decision that the council had not anticipated from a man who had spent two centuries being decoratively cooperative. He had refused. He had not simply declined the summons, he had disappeared. This was the act that had lit the council's wrath like a torch to dry timber. A prince who refused his claiming was, under the blood laws, considered to have forfeited his line's protections. He could be hunted. He could be brought back by force, and the agents the council dispatched for such purposes were not gentle about it. Evander had spent 4 weeks moving between safe houses maintained by a network of vampires who owed his bloodline old loyalties, using routes that predated the modern city by several centuries, staying ahead of the council's hunters by margins that grew smaller with every passing week. He had arrived in this city, in this particular neighborhood, because of a name in a letter written by his brother 3 months before Caius died. Caius had written about the Meridian Archive. He had written about the woman who ran its lower catalogue, the human archivist who had spent years cataloguing vampire court documents without apparently understanding what they were, who had been quietly and systematically creating the most accurate record of vampire territorial agreements in existence, because she was simply very good at her job, and the materials had come to her through entirely legal channels of academic acquisition. Caius had written that this archive and this woman might matter someday. He had written it in the particular way that people write about things they are afraid to say to directly, and Evander had thought about that letter every day since his brother died. He had not meant to come here in crisis. He had meant to come here carefully, to introduce himself properly, to explain what the archive actually contained and give the archivist the choice to destroy the more dangerous documents before anyone else found them. He had meant to do all of this with the dignity befitting his bloodline. Instead, he had arrived bleeding from a hunter's blade and collapsed against her shelving, and she had turned off the lights and apparently moved like a woman who had practiced moving in the dark. In the 45 seconds of blackness, Lucia navigated from the electrical panel to the far wall by memory, found the emergency torch she kept there by touch, and did not turn it on immediately, because she had learned in 4 years of late-night archive work that the person who controls the light controls the room. She could hear the hunter moving, the soft sound of careful footsteps, and she could hear Evander's breath, which was slower and more controlled, and coming from a different direction, which meant he had moved during the blackout as well. The emergency override engaged. Low amber light returned to the space. The hunter was facing the wrong direction. He had expected her to run for the stairs. Evander, who had apparently used the darkness to his considerable advantage, had the hunter by the collar and the wrist simultaneously, and the blade was on the floor, and the expression on the hunter's face was the expression of a man reassessing every decision he had made in the last 5 minutes. "The archive is neutral ground," Evander said, and his voice had changed. There was nothing uncertain in it now. It was the voice of someone who had commanded rooms for centuries, who wore authority the way other people wore breathing, who had simply needed 30 seconds and the absence of a blade at his throat to remember who he was. "You have violated the old covenant by bringing a drawn weapon into a record house. You will leave this city. You will tell the council that the prince was not found here. You will carry that story back to Mordavia, or you will not carry anything back at all." The hunter left. Evander watched him go with crimson-edged eyes that tracked every step to the door, and then the door closed and the archive was very quiet. Lucia stood with her hands loose at her sides and her heart doing something disorganized in her chest that she was fairly certain had nothing to do with fear and rather a lot to do with the way he had said the phrase, "the old covenant," as though it were something he carried in his bones. "You know about the covenant," she said. It was not quite a question. He turned to look at her, and she watched him absorb the fact that she had said covenant instead of some variation of what just happened, and something in his expression shifted, some slight recalibration. "You know what this archive contains," he said. "I know what I catalogued," she said. "I've been cataloguing vampire court documents for 3 years, and you're the first vampire I've ever seen in person. But I know exactly what the materials indicate about territorial agreements, succession laws, and the specific language of neutral site covenants as they applied to record houses and libraries across the old European courts." She paused. "You're bleeding quite seriously. Is there something I should know about vampire first aid? Or is this one of those situations where you heal on your own?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very precisely, as though he were weighing each word before releasing it, "I heal, but not instantaneously. Silver-edged wounds slow the process." "There's a first aid kit in the storage room," she said. "It won't have anything for silver specifically, but pressure and clean linen might help in the meantime. And I have questions." "I imagine you do," he said. "I'll answer yours first," she said, which was not what he had been expecting, because he had not said he had questions, and she watched the slight fracture of surprise cross his face, before his composure resettled over it like water returning to stillness. "You're here because of the archive. You're here because of what I've been cataloguing. And you're Evander Lazarescu, which means you're connected to the Lazarescu bloodline, which is Moldavian, which means at least 12 of the bound volumes in the Upper East section of this archive directly can concern your family's territorial agreements." She walked toward the storage room, and he followed her, which felt significant in a way she could not yet name. The storage room was small and practical, and smelled of cedar and archival paper. She found the first aid kit and turned to find him standing in the doorway looking at the shelving with an expression she recognized, because she had worn it herself many times in the presence of very old and very important things. "Those are Caius's letters," he said. He was looking at a sealed box on the second shelf. He said his brother's name with a flatness that contained enormous weight. I know," she said. "They came in the acquisition 5 months ago. I haven't catalogued them yet. I was saving them." She hesitated. "I'm sorry about your brother." He looked at her, and this time the surprise was deeper and less quickly concealed. "You know he's dead," he said. "I know a great deal," she said, not unkindly. "I'm very good at my job. Now will you let me look at this wound, or would you prefer to bleed on my cedar shelving?" He sat on the low storage stool with the particular grace of someone who has never done an ungraceful thing in his life and allows this to continue even when wounded. And she cleaned the wound at his ribs with the methodical steadiness she brought to everything. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who are both accustomed to being alone with important things and have just discovered someone else who understands what that feels like. "Why did you refuse the claiming?" she asked. She kept her eyes on her work. "Because it would have made me a figurehead for a council that murdered my brother," he said. "And because I do not consent to chains simply because they are made of gold." "Do you know who killed him?" "I have significant evidence that it was orchestrated by a faction within the council itself," he said. "Lord Vasiliev and his aligned houses. Caius was moving to reform the blood laws. He wanted to dismantle several of the old covenants that have kept humans in the dark about vampire existence for 3 centuries. He believed the secrecy was no longer sustainable or ethical. The council disagreed." Lucia sat back on her heels and looked at him directly for the first time since she had begun cleaning the wound, and she registered again with a kind of helpless clarity just how extraordinary he looked. Not in the way of fiction's vampires, all shadow and menace, but in the way of something genuinely ancient, someone who had watched centuries turn and carried all of them in the particular still quality of his bearing. His hair was the color of new snow, and his eyes were dark and shot through with that deep crimson that pulsed faintly when he was thinking hard, and his face was the face of someone who had learned to keep a great deal behind it and was currently not entirely succeeding. "The documents in this archive," she said, "the ones I've been cataloguing. They include the territorial records that would prove Vasiliev's house illegally annexed blood covenant territories that belonged to the Lazarescu line after your brother died." "Yes," he said. "Which means this archive contains the evidence you need to take to the Allied courts to challenge the Council's authority over the succession." "Yes," he said again, and this time the word was weighted differently, heavier with something that might have been hope and might have been the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running for weeks, and has just discovered they may have been running towards something all along. "Caius wrote to you about me?" she said. It was not entirely a question. The silence stretched for a breath. 3 months before he died, Evander said. He said you were building something without knowing what you were building. He said you were very precise and very fearless, and that he trusted you more than any human he had encountered in 2 centuries. A pause. He said if things went badly, the archive might be the only safe place left. Lucia thought about the sealed box of letters on the shelf. She thought about the way Caius had phrased certain acquisition requests with a formality that she had attributed to European academic convention and now understood as something else entirely. He was protecting this place, she said. He was protecting you, Evander said, by making sure the archive was formally designated as a neutral record house under the Old Covenant, which is why the hunter could not remain once I invoked it. A human who holds covenant-protected materials has the right of sanctuary. I didn't know that. Caius did, Evander said. He was considerably more thoughtful about these things than people gave him credit for. She heard the grief in that clearly, the sharp edge of it under the controlled surface, and she did not speak for a moment because some things deserve the space of silence. You need somewhere to stay, she said eventually. Tonight, at minimum. The hunter will go back to the council. They'll send others. I should not involve you further, he said, and he said it with conviction, but she noticed that he had not moved toward the door. The archive is already involved, she said. I'm already involved. I've been cataloguing the evidence of a vampire royal assassination for 3 years and I didn't know it, and now I do. And I'm not someone who discovers that the materials in her care are historically and politically critical and then sets them aside because things became inconvenient. She stood, gathering the first aid materials with brisk efficiency. My apartment is 3 blocks from here. It's also registered under a different name because I have a complicated landlord situation, so it shouldn't appear in any record search for this address. You can use the guest room. We can spend tomorrow going through the documentation and determining what you need and what strategy makes the most sense for getting you safely to wherever you need to go to present it. He stood, and he was tall in the way that people who are accustomed to being the most significant person in a room are sometimes tall, not aggressive but simply present, and he looked at her with those crimson-edged eyes, and she held his gaze steadily because she had decided long before this evening that steadiness was something she owed herself. Why would you do this? He asked. You have no obligation to a vampire court, to a succession dispute, to a prince you met 20 minutes ago. I have an obligation to the materials in my care, she said. And I have an obligation to the person who trusted this archive enough to build it into a safe place for important things. Your brother treated my work as worth protecting. The least I can do is return the favor. She moved toward the door. Also, she added, more quietly, you refused a throne on principle and you came here bleeding and alone rather than let people be hurt on your behalf, and I think those things matter. She heard him exhale behind her, a soft, controlled sound that might have been the beginning of something he did not yet have a word for. The 3 blocks to her apartment were cold and very quiet at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, and they walked without talking. Close enough that she could have touched him if she'd reached sideways, far enough apart that they were not quite touching. She was aware of him beside her with a clarity that had nothing to do with threat assessment, which was new and interesting information about herself that she stored away to examine later. Her apartment was the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian building, accessed by a back staircase that she had always preferred because it was private, and because the main entrance hall had a light that flickered in a way she found irritating. The apartment itself was what happened when an archivist with no particular interest in minimalism is given approximately 1,200 square feet and left entirely alone with her book collection, which meant the walls were lined and the floors had navigable pathways and the kitchen table served double duty as a research surface. Evander stood in the center of the main room and looked at it for a long moment. You read Old Moldavian, he said. He was looking at a book on the table. Enough to catalogue, she said. I've been self-teaching for about 18 months. Some of the court documents were partially in Old Moldavian and I needed to understand what I was handling. That language has not been in active use since 1743, he said. I'm aware, she said. I used a 17th century grammar manual and some comparative vocabulary tables. It took a while. He picked up the book on her table, and she watched him hold it with the careful automatic reverence of someone for whom physical books are never casual objects, and she felt something warm and entirely unbidden move through her chest. The guest room is the second door on the left, she said. The bathroom is directly across from it. I'll make tea. He looked up from the book. You're making tea, he said, not as a question, more as though he were registering the fact that this was the most unexpectedly ordinary thing that had happened to him in several weeks. It's late and I've had a stressful evening, she said. Tea is what I do with stressful evenings. I cannot drink tea, he said. I know, she said. I'm making it for me. You can keep looking at the book. She made tea, and he sat at her kitchen table and looked at the book, and then he began to talk about it, which she had not expected, quietly and with a formality that gradually loosened as the evening wore on. And she sat across from him, with her hands wrapped around her mug, and listened to him describe the court of Moldavia in 1689 with the precision and involuntary affection of someone recounting a place they cannot go back to, and she asked questions when she had them, which was often because she was genuinely interested, and because she had learned long ago that asking good questions was one of the most powerful things a person could do. Around midnight, he stopped in the middle of a sentence about the architectural changes to the court's eastern wing, and looked at her with those remarkable eyes and said, "You're not afraid of me?" "Should I be?" she asked. "Most humans who discover what I am experience fear as their primary response," he said. "It's generally adaptive. I've spent 3 years reading vampire court documents," she said. "Fear as an abstract concept has been somewhat normalized for me. Also, you clearly decided not to hurt me approximately 30 seconds after I turned off the lights in the archive, and I'm reasonably good at reading people. Even," she added, "people who have been reading other people for 200 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 243 years to be precise. "How old were you when you were turned?" 26, he said, in 1781. She did the math automatically. "So you're actually 26, she said. Something crossed his face that was close to a smile, not performed, not diplomatic, something genuine and slightly startled. "In a manner of speaking," he said. "That seems relevant," she said, and meant it more ways than one, and was aware that he heard all of them. She went to bed at 1 in the morning and lay awake longer than she would have liked, thinking about crimson-edged eyes, and the way he had held that book, and the specific quality of the silence between them that felt less like the absence of noise, and more like the presence of something that had not yet found its name. In the morning she made actual food, because she needed it regardless of his metabolic requirements, and found him already awake at the table with 3 of the court documents she had brought back in her bag, spread before him, and her old Moldavian grammar open beside them, which was simultaneously an invasion of her work materials, and the most flattering thing anyone had done with her research infrastructure in recent memory. "Vasiliev's house is documented in the Breslau Compact of 1847, he said, without looking up. "You've cross-referenced it with the Vienna Addendum from 1901 and the Iasi Territorial Declaration of 1923. This is extremely thorough. Thank you," she said. It took about 8 months to get those 3 documents talking to each other. "The chain of evidence this creates," he said, and now he did look up, and there was something bright and urgent in his expression that sat differently on his face than the controlled gravity she had seen last night. Something more alive, "is sufficient to bring a formal challenge before the Continental Court. The Allied Covenant recognizes record house documentation as primary evidence. If these documents are presented through the proper covenant channels with an archivist's attestation, the Council cannot simply dismiss them." "Who do we need to take them to?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in a way that told her the answer was not straightforward. "The Continental Court convenes once per season under the Covenant of the Old Knight," he said. "The next session is in 12 days. It sits in Vienna in the subterranean court beneath the 4th District." "We," she said. She had said it first, and she waited to see if he would address it. He looked at her steadily. "You would need to come," he said, An archivist's attestation requires the physical presence of the archivist before the court. A document presented without its keeper carries less covenant weight. This was Caius's design, I think. He would have known. He made sure the archive would need me specifically, she said. He made sure you couldn't be cut out of the equation, Evander said. Which is very like him. She thought about this. She thought about 12 days in Vienna and a subterranean court, and the fact that she had 3 weeks of unscheduled archive leave she had been meaning to take since August. She thought about the box of sealed letters on the cedar shelf that Caius Lazarescu had written and trusted to her archive and never got to see catalogued. Tell me the risks, she said. All of them, including the ones you think might make me say no. He told her all of them. It took 40 minutes. The risks were significant and he did not minimize any of them. Presenting them with the same precise clarity he had used to describe the documents, and she found that this was the most trustworthy thing about him, that when she asked for honesty, he gave it to her without the softening that was also a form of condescension. When he finished, she said, "All right, I'll need to photograph and digitally back up every document in this sequence before we leave. If something happens to the physical materials, we need the record to survive." "That is a sensible precaution," he said. "And I need you to tell me everything you know about the Continental Court," she said. "Protocol, power dynamics, who the allied houses are, who might be sympathetic to your case versus hostile. I don't walk into unfamiliar rooms without understanding the terrain." "Neither do I," he said, and it was said with a warmth she had not heard from him yet. Genuine recognition, the particular pleasure of finding someone whose mind works in a way that resonates with your own. They spent the next 4 days in her apartment, working in a rhythm that established itself with the organic inevitability of things that are simply correct. She photographed and catalogued and cross-referenced. He translated the passages of Old Moldavian that were beyond her current vocabulary and answered her questions about court dynamics with a patience that surprised her, given that he was 243 years old and had every conceivable reason to find the process frustrating. She made food at regular intervals and did not make him feel awkward about not eating it. He made her stop working at 11 each night by the simple expedient of closing whichever document she was currently reviewing and placing it beyond her reach and saying, with absolute calm authority, "You will not function correctly tomorrow if you continue tonight." She argued with him about this exactly once and then accepted it because he was right. On the third evening, the argument was about something else entirely, which was the question of whether she was going to Vienna because she had chosen to, or because the covenant structure gave her no practical alternative, and she told him firmly that she was going because she had chosen to, and that there was a difference between a constrained choice and no choice at all, and that she was capable of determining which category her decisions fell into. "I know that," he said, and he said it with a seriousness that made clear he had actually been thinking about it. "I wanted you to know that I know that I am not treating your presence as assumed." She looked at him across the table. "Evander," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name directly, and she watched the effect it had on him, the minimal but real response, like a current finding ground. "I'm here because I want to be. That's enough." The night before they were to leave, she found him standing at her window at 2 a.m, looking at the city below. She had gotten up for water and seen the light under the guest room door was still on, and knocked quietly and found the room empty. She stood in the doorway to the sitting room and did not announce herself immediately, because he was very still in the way of someone deep inside a thought that needed finishing. And she had lived alone long enough to understand that interior space deserves the same courtesy as physical space. After a moment he said, without turning, "You're awake." "So are you," she said, and came to stand beside him at the window. The city was the particular kind of beautiful it only was in the deep late hours, all amber light and emptiness, the streets holding their shapes without the noise that usually filled them. "I dreamed of Caius," he said. "Vampires do not generally dream. When we do, it tends to be significant." She did not say anything immediately. She waited. "He was alive in it," Evander said. "We were in the eastern garden of the courthouse the way it was in the 1840s before the renovations. He was telling me something, and I could not hear him over the wind." A pause. I have been trying to finish that sentence since I woke up. What do you think he was trying to say? She asked. Evander turned to look at her, and in the amber light from the window his white hair was warm gold at the edges, and his eyes were very dark, and the crimson at the rim of them was soft, not burning. He looked in this moment exactly like what he was. Someone ancient and alone, who had been carrying an enormous weight, and was standing very close to another person in the dark in a way that meant something. I think, he said carefully, that he would have been very pleased about this. He glanced briefly at the room, the books, the table, the life she had built here. About you, he said. I think he would have said that he was right. Was he often right? She asked. Inconveniently, Evander said, and there it was again, that almost smile. And she was beginning to understand that when it appeared, it was because he had forgotten, for a moment, to be careful. She wanted, suddenly, and without particular confusion about the wanting, to see him forget to be careful more often. Go to sleep, she said, because it was the responsible thing to say, and also because she needed to put some distance between herself and the way the amber light was making his face look. Lucia, he said as she turned. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for the archive, for the lights, for all of it. I want you to know that whatever happens in Vienna, whatever the court decides, I will not let anything happen to you. That is not a diplomatic courtesy, it is a vow. She looked at him for a long moment in the amber-warm dark. I believe you, she said. Good night, Evander. She went back to bed, and this time she fell asleep quickly, which told her something about what trust did for a body. They left the next evening. Because Evander could not travel in direct sunlight, and because the night trains between major European cities were an old and practical infrastructure that vampire travelers had been quietly using for considerably longer than the railways themselves had existed. Lucia had packed the documents in archival quality containers and backed everything up on 2 separate encrypted drives, one of which she kept on her person, and one of which she had mailed to the archive's secure secondary location 2 days prior. Evander had procured travel papers by means she did not ask about, because she understood that some questions were less about ignorance and more about maintaining a functional relationship with the spaces one had to navigate, and she trusted him enough by now to believe that the methods were within the bounds of whatever code he operated by. The train was an overnight service, and they had a private compartment, and the rhythm of the rails was an old and reliable sedative. She slept for 5 hours, and woke to find him sitting across from her in the dark, perfectly still, watching the darkened landscape pass with an expression of such private and concentrated sadness that she felt the intrusion of waking sharply. He looked at her when she moved. You have been watching the countryside for hours, she said. I have crossed this landscape many times, he said. It looks different now than when Caius was alive, he said simply. She sat up, and the darkness between them was comfortable enough now that she could say, Tell me about him, and mean it as the gift it was intended as, and he did. He talked about his brother for 2 hours as the train moved east, and what emerged from those 2 hours was a portrait of someone who had been, by any measure, extraordinary. A vampire who had wanted desperately to change the things about his world that were wrong, who had moved carefully and brilliantly within the constraints of a court that would have destroyed him if he had moved too fast, who had believed that the secrecy between vampire and human society was an ethical failure being sustained by those who benefited from it, who had trusted a human archivist with the materials of his people because he thought she was the kind of person who could handle the truth. He was right about that, at least, Lucia said. He was right about most things, Evander said. He was wrong about the council. He believed they could be reformed from within. I think he underestimated how much they feared change. Is that why you refused the claiming? She asked. Because taking the throne through their process would have made you complicit in the system he died trying to change. He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one that meant she had said something that landed precisely where he had not expected to be hit. Yes, he said, that is exactly why. So the goal in Vienna isn't just to save yourself, she said. It's to do what Caius was trying to do. I cannot reform the court from exile, he said, and I will not take the throne on the council's terms. But if the allied courts recognize the evidence you've catalogued, they can compel the council to open the succession to legitimate challenge. It would mean a new process, one not controlled by Vasiliev's faction. It would mean the reforms Caius proposed could be brought before the full court rather than suppressed. "And would you take the throne on those terms?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, and she did not rush the silence. "If it meant that what he built could be continued," he said finally. "Yes." She looked at him in the move dark and thought about the kind of person who spends 2 centuries building a careful distance from power and then accepts it because someone they loved died trying to make it better. She thought about what Caius had written in his letter. She thought about why he had trusted this particular archive and this particular archivist, and whether he had suspected that the 2 things his brother needed most, the evidence and the person who could properly present it, might end up being the same thing. Vienna arrived at dawn, and they took the underground passage from the station directly into the 4th District's subterranean levels, where the architecture changed from modern transit utility to something much older and much more deliberate. The Allied Covenant's meeting court beneath Vienna had been built in the 18th century and maintained with a careful respect for original materials that Lucia recognized and appreciated on a professional level, even as the political weight of the space pressed against her awareness like a physical thing. The corridors were lit by gas lamps that had been converted to electric elements but retained their original housings, and the walls were old stone that held the accumulated cold of centuries, and the sound of their footsteps was the only sound until they turned a final corner and came into a broad anteroom where 3 figures waited, which was not what Lucia had expected. Evander had been expected, she understood immediately. The 3 figures, 2 women and a man, all carrying the unmistakable quality of very old vampires, white-haired and composed and radiating the kind of authority that does not require announcement, had been waiting for him. Evander, the older of the 2 women, said. She had the kind of voice that had been commanding rooms since before the buildings that currently existed had been built. We had begun to wonder if the council's hunters had succeeded. "Countess Serafina," Evander said. He stood very straight, and she watched the full sovereignty of his bearing come forward, not performed, simply present. The prince, who had been living in careful concealment for 4 weeks, stepping back into himself with the ease of someone reclaiming something that had always belonged to them. They did not. "I am here, and I have brought what we need." The countess looked at Lucia with eyes that were silver at the center, and very still. "The archivist," she said. "Lucia Vaughn," Lucia said. She held the countess's gaze steadily. "I hold covenant-designated custody of the Meridian Archives documentation relating to the Lazarescu bloodline's territorial agreements, the Breslau Compact of 1847, the Vienna Addendum of 1901, and the Iasi Territorial Declaration of 1923, among approximately 40 other relevant documents. I am prepared to present an attestation before the court." The countess was silent for a moment. Then she said to Evander, "Your brother was right about her." "He usually was," Evander said. What followed was 12 hours of court procedure conducted in a chamber beneath the street that smelled of old stone and candle wax, and the particular metallic clarity of aged air. The Continental Court in full session was 14 representative houses, each with their own protocol and presence, and the proceedings were conducted with a formality that was simultaneously archaic and extremely precise. Lucia had catalogued enough court documents to understand the structural logic of the process, and she followed it with the attention she gave to all important things, which was complete and unsentimental. The presentation of her documentation took 3 hours. She spoke with the same precision she brought to her archive work, citing provenance and cross-reference with enough accuracy that the Allied House's own archival delegates confirmed her attestation twice over. The documents showed clearly and completely what she had spent 3 years building. A record of Vasiliev's house systematically annexing Lazarescu territorial rights in the period immediately following Caius's death, moves that were legally grounded only in the assumption that the Lazarescu bloodline had no surviving legitimate heir to contest them, an assumption that became void. The moment Evander Lazarescu stood before the court alive and attested by a covenant-protected archivist, Evander presented the political case himself. She sat beside him at the document table, and watched him address 14 vampire houses, with the complete authority of someone who had been born to this, and had spent 2 centuries thinking carefully about what to do with the fact, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her by its calmness, that she had never in her life been in the presence of someone who was so entirely themselves. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Vasiliev faction, represented by 2 allied houses at the Continental Court, attempted 3 procedural challenges and was overruled on each one. The court declared the council's succession proceedings invalid and ordered a new claiming process to be conducted under the oversight of the allied houses rather than the Moldavian Blood Council alone. Vasiliev himself, absent and unrepresented, was cited for covenant violation in the matter of the assassination, and the matter would be taken up at the next full Moldavian court session under Allied oversight. It was not everything. It was not the immediate dismantling of every system Caius had wanted to change, but it was the door opened, and it was opened because of 3 years of careful archival work by a human woman in a city basement who had catalogued materials she had not fully understood and had handled them with the respect that important things deserve. When the court session was declared closed and the chamber began to clear, Lucia sat for a moment at the document table in the old stone room and felt the particular quiet that comes after a very large thing has finished. She was tired in the deep way that is partly physical and partly something that lives in the chest, and she was also, underneath the tiredness, something she recognized after a moment as satisfied. Evander came to stand beside her, and she looked up at him, and his expression was the one she had not seen yet, not the controlled gravity, and not the almost smile, but something fully open. Something she thought might be the face he had before he had learned to keep things behind it. "It's done," she said. "The beginning is done," he said. "The harder work comes after. When do you go back to Moldavia?" "The Allied court has ordered a branch there within 3 days," he said, "to oversee the transition and ensure the proceedings begin correctly." Pause. A pause. "I will be expected to remain for some time." She nodded. She understood this. She had understood it was coming. She began to gather the documents into their archival containers with the careful automatic efficiency of someone giving their hands something to do. "Lucia," he said. She looked up. "Come with me," he said. It was not a command, and it was not quite a request. It was something more carefully balanced than either, and she understood that the balance was deliberate, that he was offering without assuming, asking without pressure, which was all the more remarkable in a man who had been accustomed to authority for over 2 centuries. "To Moldavia," she said. "To the court," he said. "Officially. There are still significant archival materials that pertain to the succession proceedings and the covenant restoration. The court will need someone to catalogue and attest to them. Someone with covenant standing and the appropriate expertise." He paused. "Unofficially, I am asking because I do not want to do any of this without you nearby, and I have been aware of that fact for approximately 4 days, and I am telling you because I said I would not treat your presence as assumed, and I meant it." She put down the archival container. She looked at him for a long moment across the old stone room, in the light of converted gas lamps, and she thought about all the things she had discovered in the past 12 days. That vampire court documents were not metaphorical. That trust could be built quickly between the right people. That she was capable of moving through a blacked-out basement and an overnight train and a 14-house court, proceeding with equal steadiness. That she had been building towards something without knowing what she was building, and that the person standing in front of her had been doing the same. "The archive will need to be properly handed off," she said. "I'll need to document the chain of custody for everything still in the collection. That will take a few days." Something in his face shifted very slightly, in the way that a landscape shifts when light shines it. "Of course," he said. "And I'll want a proper workspace at the court," she said. "I don't function well without proper conditions for the materials. The court has an archive room that has not been properly maintained for 60 years, he said. "I suspect it needs someone with your particular abilities. It probably needs someone with my particular abilities quite urgently," she said. "Quite urgently," he agreed, and the warmth in it was real and unhidden. "Then yes," she said. "I'll come." He crossed the distance between them in a movement that was too graceful to be hurried but arrived immediately, and he held her face in both hands with a gentleness that was not the same thing as uncertainty, and looked at her with those crimson-edged eyes at very close range, and said very quietly, "Lucia." "That's my name," she said, because even now she was who she was. The sound he made was genuinely warm and fully involuntary, and she filed it away with all the other information she was accumulating about who he was under the gravity. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt the extraordinary cold of him, and also the extraordinary presence of him, the specific way a person occupies space when they are very much themselves. And she closed her eyes for a moment and was simply in it. Then she stepped back and picked up the archival container, because the documents needed proper handling regardless of what else was happening. And he watched her with an expression that was now simply full and unguarded and entirely himself. And she thought that this was what 243 years of careful containment looked like when it finally let go. They returned to her city together. She spent 3 days properly transferring the archive's custody, training her deputy cataloguer on the covenant materials with extensive documentation of their significance, mailing the secondary encrypted drives to 3 different secure institutions, with covering letters that explained exactly what they contained and why they mattered, and writing the most comprehensive handoff document in the history of the Meridian Archive, which her deputy later described as simultaneously the most useful and most intimidating thing she had ever read. Evander stayed in the guest room and worked at the kitchen table, and they ate dinner together every evening. And on the last evening before they left for Mordevia, she made something with pasta, because it was the most complicated thing she knew how to cook, and she had wanted to make it for someone for a long time. And there was finally someone present who had sat at her table long enough to make the occasion feel real. He sat across from her in her kitchen with the food he could not eat and said, completely without ceremony, "This apartment smells like you. I will think about it when I am in the court and things are difficult." She looked at him. "That is a very honest thing to say." "I have found," he said, "that honesty is more efficient than the alternative. I spent a great deal of my first century being diplomatically indirect, and I found it exhausting." "Good," she said. "I'm not particularly good at indirect. I know," he said. "It is one of the things I value most about you." She put her fork down and looked at him in the warm kitchen light. And she thought about all the things that had been said between them in the past 12 days, and all the things that had not been said, but had been present in the silences, and she thought that she had been alone in this apartment for 4 years, and had been largely content with that. And that contentment was a different thing from this, which was more alive, and more complicated, and considerably more worth it. "I'm in love with you," she said, because she was not good at indirect. "I thought you should know that before we go anywhere together." He was very still for a moment in the way that she had learned meant something significant was happening behind the stillness. Then he said, "I have been in love with you since you turned off the lights in the archive basement and moved with complete precision in the dark, and then offered me your guest room and went to make tea." "That was 12 days ago," she said. "I am 243 years old," he said. "I understand the difference between something that takes time to become and something that simply is. This is the second kind." She got up from the table and crossed to him, and he stood as she reached him, and when she kissed him it was not tentative or performative. It was the kiss of 2 people who have already decided, who are not seeking permission or testing limits, but simply arriving at the thing they have been moving toward. And it had the quality of the best archival discoveries, the ones where everything that was already there suddenly becomes legible. Mordevia was everything Evander had described, and several things he had not, which she suspected was because he had not fully allowed himself to imagine returning until it was actually happening. The courthouse was a complex of buildings in the foothills of the Carpathians, connected to a modern city by an underground rail line that had been disguised as an industrial maintenance tunnel since 1921, and the buildings themselves were the layered result of 8 centuries of construction. The oldest parts in stone that had been old when they were built, the later parts in a dark wood that had been maintained with such care that it still held its original color. The Allied Court's oversight team arrived the same day, They did, and the procedure established the new claiming process began within the week. Evander moved through the court's complex political landscape with a precision and authority that she watched with frank admiration, not because she had doubted him, but because watching someone be extraordinary at the thing they were made for is always worth watching. The archive room was every bit as neglected as he had indicated. 60 years of organizational abandonment compressed into a space that had once been, she could tell from the structure of the shelving and the quality of the materials, a genuinely excellent working archive. She spent the first week simply assessing, cataloging the catalog's own failures, which she found strangely satisfying, in the way that complex problems always were. Vasiliev's faction made 2 further attempts to disrupt the proceedings. One, a procedural challenge through an allied house they had apparently been cultivating for decades, and one something more direct that resulted in a confrontation in the court's eastern corridor at 3 a.m. that she was not present for, but heard about in precise detail from Evander, who arrived at the archive room afterward with his expression set in the particular controlled way she had learned. Meant something had happened that he was managing very hard. She had put down the document she was working on and said, "Tell me," he had told her. 3 of Vasiliev's agents had attempted to access the archive room. They had been stopped by the Allied court security before reaching it, but the implication was clear. The documents she was organizing were still a target, and as long as they remained the primary physical evidence base for the succession challenge, so was she. "So we need to accelerate the documentation transfer," she said. "If the materials exist in multiple certified covenant-attested copies held by multiple allied houses simultaneously, targeting any single location or individual becomes pointless." He looked at her with that expression that was recognition and admiration and something softer underneath both. "Yes," he said. "I can have the priority documents certified and distributed within 4 days if I work through the nights," she said. "The Allied court delegates will need to provide their covenant seals." "I will arrange it," he said. He came around the work table to where she was sitting and put his hands on her shoulders from behind, not constraining, simply present, and she leaned back against him slightly and felt the cold and the steadiness of him. And they stayed like that for a moment in the archive room with its repaired shelving and its slowly emerging order. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "A little," she said. "Is that useful information?" "Yes," he said. "It means you understand the situation accurately." "I thought it," she said. "Are you afraid?" A pause. "Of Vasiliev's faction, no," he said. "Of what happens to you if I am not careful enough, yes. That fear is constant." "Then be careful," she said, "and let me do the same. We're better at this together than apart." He pressed his lips to the top of her head in a gesture that was entirely tender, and very much not something the fearsome Lazarescu prince of the court documents would have been described as capable of. And she thought about Caius writing his letter 3 months before he died and wondering if things went badly. And she thought that things had gone badly and had then, with a great deal of work and some very good archival cataloguing, becomes something else. She worked through the nights for 4 days. He was present each night, bringing her the particular herbed tea she had become attached to, and sitting across the work table in the archive room's low lamplight, working through his own materials, and the rhythm they had established in her apartment translated perfectly to this new place in the way that things which are actually right translate anywhere. The priority documents were distributed within the week. The Allied court certified the copies. The evidence became, as she had intended, too widely held to be meaningfully targeted. Vasiliev was formally cited for covenant violation by the Allied court 6 weeks after the Vienna session. 2 of his Allied houses withdrew their support within days of the citation, which reduced his faction to a political remnant without the structural power to challenge the proceedings. The new claiming process moved forward under Allied oversight, and Evander stood before the restored Moldavian court on a cold December evening and completed the claiming under terms that were nothing like the gilded cage the old council had designed. Terms that gave the throne its authority and gave the court its voice without subordinating either to a council that had proven itself capable of murder. She stood in the observers' gallery with Countess Serafina beside her, and, watched him receive the covenant of the throne, with the bearing that was simply his, sovereign and steady and entirely present, and she felt something in her chest that was not complicated at all. After, in the eastern garden that Caius had planted in the 1840s, and that had survived every renovation because it had been built well and maintained with love, she stood beside Evander in the cold December air, and he held her hands in both of his, and the garden was the color of old silver in the moonlight, and she thought about the sealed box of letters on the cedar shelf that she would need to properly catalogue soon. "Your brother's letters," she said. "I should bring them here. They belong in this archive." "Yes," he said. "I'll add them to the next transfer," she said. "I'll make sure they're properly catalogued. His name on every item, every letter, every record he created." She looked up at him. "He deserves that, for his work to have his name on it." Evander's hands tightened slightly on hers. "He would have been very annoyed that I'm the one who ended up with the throne," he said, with the dry quality of someone who is very close to genuinely speaking about grief rather than around it. "Would he?" she said. "He would have said he spent 2 centuries trying to reform it from below, and I managed it by running away long enough to let someone else do the groundwork," Evander said. "He would have said it in a way that was also a compliment. He was very good at that." "He was right about you," she said. "About what you'd do with it, I mean. He knew you'd refuse the old council's terms. He knew that if things went badly enough, you'd refuse loudly enough to matter." He looked at her in the cold moonlit garden, and his expression was fully open and fully his, the face that had taken most of 3 months to show itself, the face of someone who had finally put down something very heavy and found that what was waiting underneath it was not emptiness, but this. "He also knew," Evander said, "that I would need help doing it. He had very good taste in archivists," she said. "Exceptional," he said, "in archivists and in many other things." She rose onto her toes and kissed him in the silver garden in the cold December air, and he gathered her in with the careful, absolute completeness of someone who knows the precise value of what they are holding, and the old courthouse rose around them with its centuries of stone and its slowly restored archive, and all the materials that had survived, properly catalogued and attested, waiting for the future that had been built to hold them. The archive room she had taken over became, in the months that followed, something she was genuinely proud of. She hired 2 assistant archivists, both young vampires who had studied archival science at European universities, and who treated the materials with the respect they deserved, and together they rebuilt the court's documentary record from its 60 years of neglect into a functioning and genuinely excellent archive that served both the court's current political needs and its deep historical record. She wrote 2 papers that spring, both published in academic journals under her standard professional name, both concerning the archival methodology she had developed for cross-referencing multilingual court documents with overlapping jurisdictional claims, both peer-reviewed and well-received, neither of which explicitly mentioned that the institutions they discussed were vampire courts, because she was an archivist with a commitment to accuracy, and she understood perfectly well that some contexts required careful navigation of what was and was not ready to be public knowledge. Caius had believed the secrecy was unsustainable and unethical. Evander had inherited that belief and was working carefully and with the patience of someone who understood that fundamental change is a matter of decades rather than moments, toward the conditions that would make a different relationship between vampire and human society possible. It was slow work and complicated work, and it was, she thought, the right work. She was part of it, not as a symbol or a diplomatic gesture, but as herself, as the archivist who had catalogued the evidence, as the person who had turned off the lights in the basement, and the woman who had learnt Old Moldavian from a 17th century grammar manual and had decided, at approximately 10:30 on a Tuesday night, that the things in her care were worth protecting, on the evening of the spring equinox, which was a date that carried significance in the vampire court calendar that she had spent considerable time understanding and had come to appreciate for its elegance. Evander came to the archive room as she was closing it for the evening, and he had with him, held very carefully in both hands, the sealed box of his brother's letters that had made the journey from the cedar shelf of her apartment's storage room to this place. She took it from him and held it, and the weight of it was the weight of something that had waited long enough to arrive where it belonged. "I thought we might open it together," he said. She looked at him. "Tonight, if you're willing," he said. "I have been putting it off because—" He stopped. He tried again. I was not sure I was ready to hear what he was trying to say, in the dream, on the train. She set the box on the central work table and looked at the seal, which was Caius's personal seal. The Lazarescu crest, with a small additional device beneath it that was Caius's own modification. She had looked at it dozens of times in the archive basement, and had always thought there was something deliberate about the additional device. Something that was not purely decorative. "It's a book," she said. "The device under the crest. It's a small open book." Evander leaned in to look. He was very still for a moment. "He added that himself," he said quietly. "That was not the standard crest. He added a book," she said, "to the seal on letters he sent to an archive." "He was telling you what they were," Evander said. "From the beginning, he was telling you the archive was the point." She broke the seal carefully, preserving the wax, and inside the box were 31 letters in Caius's handwriting. Some in Moldavian and some in English, and some in a combination of both, written over a period of approximately 8 months, addressed not to a name but to the keeper of the record, and each one was precisely what the archive needed, and precisely what she had been building without knowing it. A direct contemporary account of the events leading up to his death, the names of the players, the structure of Vassiliev's conspiracy, the evidence that had not been in any other document she had catalogued, because Caius had kept it deliberately separate, trusting that the archive would exist long enough and be maintained carefully enough by the right person that it would eventually reach the hands it needed to reach. He had been right. She and Evander read them together at the work table in the archive room with the lamp between them, reading aloud the passages that needed translation and reading silently the ones that were clear. And the room was very quiet except for their voices and the sound of paper turning. And Caius Lazarescu's voice came through the letters with a precision and warmth and dry intelligence that made the room feel full. In the last letter, written 3 days before he died, he had written, "Evander, if you are reading this, then the archive did what it was supposed to do, and so did she, and I hope you have been less stubborn than usual about accepting help from the right people. You were always better at the work than you thought you were. So is she. Take care of each other." There was no signature. There did not need to be. Evander closed the last letter and sat for a long time in the lamplight, not saying anything, and she sat with him and did not fill the silence, because it was his, and it was necessary, and she had learned that some things deserve to be felt completely before they are spoken. After a long while he said, "He was right, you know. I was stubborn. You were appropriately cautious given that your brother had just been assassinated and you were being hunted," she said. "I meant about the other part," he said. She looked at him. "About you," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, that familiar gesture of presence without pressure that was entirely his. "He trusted you before I was able to. He saw what I would not have been able to see from a distance." A pause. "He trusted you with the most important thing and you earned it completely, and I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my existence, however long that is, being grateful that you turned off those lights." "Someone had to," she said. "Someone had to," he agreed, and the warmth in it was complete. She properly catalogued all 31 letters over the following week, each one with full provenance notes, each one properly sealed in archival preservation materials, each one annotated with the cross-references to the other documents in the collection that they connected to, so that anyone who came after them would understand exactly what they were looking at and exactly what they meant. She gave them their proper names. She put Caius Lazarescu's name on every item, every letter, every record he had created and trusted to her keeping. She made the archive worthy of them. She made it the kind of place that important things could trust. In the spring, when the court's eastern garden was full of the flowers that Caius had planted in the 1840s, and that bloomed every year without being tended, as though they remembered their purpose, she stood with Evander in the evening light that was golden and entirely specific to that place, that latitude, that season, and she thought about the word home, which was a word she had always understood as singular and fixed. A place rather than a state, and how she had discovered in the past several months that it was considerably more elastic than that. That home was less about coordinates, and more about the particular quality of stillness that descends when you are where you are supposed to be. She was where she was supposed to be. Evander stood beside her with his white hair warm gold at the edges in the evening light and his crimson-edged eyes that looked at her with the specific, complete attention of someone who has decided that you are where they want to look. And she thought about 12 days in her apartment and an overnight train and a 14-house court proceeding and 60 years of archival neglect being repaired and 31 letters with a small open book pressed into their seal. And she thought that Caius Lazarescu had been right about most things, and had been very right about this. Evander asked. That your brother was an excellent archivist in his own way, she said. Even if he never held the title, he would have been very pleased to hear that, Evander said. I know, she said. I'm going to put it in the catalogue notes. He laughed fully and openly, the laugh that she had worked to earn, and that remained one of the best sounds she had ever heard. Warm and real and fully present, nothing careful about it at all. She leaned into his side, and he put his arm around her, and the garden was full of flowers that remembered their purpose, and the archive behind them held everything that mattered, properly named and properly kept, and the court's lights came on, one by one, against the darkening sky, and everything that had been lost was not all recovered, but was at least accounted for, recorded, given it a proper name in the record of what had been. And that was, she had always believed, the most important thing an archivist could do. The most important thing, and she had done it. They stayed in the garden until the stars came out, and then they went inside together. And the archive room's lights were still on, and the documents were safe, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.